Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to America's Descent into Madness, Episode 2. So it's been a couple weeks back since I did Episode 1. I'll put a link in the description below where you can go back and see that video if you want to watch them back to back. Before I get started, I also want to thank all of you who support this channel financially. My videos do not receive any money from YouTube or advertisers or promotions of any kind. This channel is completely funded by viewers like you. Your generous gifts and donations to the links below to PayPal and Cash App and my P.O. Box are what keep me going and keep these videos coming to you. And so thank you for that, and please consider becoming a contributor. Also, give me a thumbs up if you like this video, share the video, and make sure and check your subscription because YouTube often unsubscribes people. So this study is my attempt to look back in time and see where we went wrong as a nation. How did we get to the situation we're in right now? On the verge of World War III, on the verge of civil war, and America so divided that each side seems insane to the other side. And it's even breaking down political barriers. You've got Republicans joining Democrats, Democrats joining Republicans, but it's split down the middle, and it mainly has to do with the thing we call the deep state, the invisible hand within the government, the invisible machine that operates on both sides of the political parties. And they can all agree on one thing. War is good. It's more now becoming about who is pro-war and who is against war, who is pro-America and who is a globalist. And this all starts with the development of the deep state. In Episode 1, we talk about the JFK unaliving of JFK. It's crazy because this division has even come into platforms that used to be considered a place for free speech. But I have to edit what I say so carefully. But nonetheless, and I'll still probably get the little conspiracy theorist, check mark up there on my on this video, but we'll see. But we looked back in time in a subsequent sermon that was not really part of was and isn't part of the series, but I talk about how 1963 was such a pivotal year. And I kind of ended the first video in the mid-70s. This is where we'll start up. America is experiencing a gas crisis. OPEC nations are holding United States hostage, and gas prices soar over $1 for the first time ever. And I remember that very well, that people were just shocked. They were shocked that gasoline cost $1 a gallon. They couldn't imagine such a thing. And in retrospect, this time period in America from 1976 to 1979, the early days of the Jimmy Carter administration, America is kind of in a golden moment. There's a lot of peace. There's a lot of prosperity. We're healing from the end of the Vietnam War, and the economy is bouncing back from a recession by the late 70s. And then two revolutions happen roughly at the same time. This is part of a communist attempt to overthrow governments around the globe and set up communist-friendly or socialist governments. This is happening in places like Iran and Nicaragua in Central America. In Iran in 1979, a group of students who were radical Muslims started a students' revolution, and they overthrew the government of the Shah of Iran, a figurehead that was put in place post-Cold War by the United States to ensure that the oil in Iran would keep coming to American oil companies. And so when the Shah was overthrown, our embassy was overran, and a large number of American hostages. I should have looked up the actual number here, but I'm thinking it was 70 or 80 hostages, something along those lines, less than 100. But they were Americans that were being kept in captivity by this new Iranian regime that we are still dealing with to this day. We're still having to deal with these same people. In fact, one of the leaders that was recently killed by an Israeli airstrike was one of the founding members and one of the authoritative thugs behind the student revolution in 1979 in Iran. In turn, thousands and thousands of Iranians that were pro-American and pro-capitalism, and many of them were Christian or non-religious Muslims, fled to this country. And I actually had the experience of knowing one of them and having a discussion at a neighborhood yard sale with this Iranian refugee that would threaten to cause a block-wide brawl. It almost broke out into a brawl when this guy started talking. And part of it is the people of America were very much kept in the dark about a lot of what was behind that revolution, what it was like for some of the people there. And we were very raw about the hostages. Jimmy Carter made a failed attempt to free the hostages. He took, I believe it was U.S. Delta forces, and they ran into a storm in the desert, a sandstorm, that caused their helicopters to crash, and it was a big debacle. It was a huge failure, probably one of the biggest failed attempts at a military operation in American history. And this very much soiled Jimmy Carter's reputation, and Ronald Reagan was able to defeat him in a landslide in the 1980 election. And part of it was Ronald Reagan was very much like Donald Trump. And he said in his speeches leading up to that on day one, even before he was inaugurated, those hostages would be released. And he threatened, military attack against Iran if they did not free our hostages, something that Jimmy Carter didn't really do. And then the hostages were literally released on the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president. And most of America, and some Americans still to this day, believe that the hostages were released because the Iranians feared Ronald Reagan. But what many people don't know is that Ronald Reagan cut a deal with the Iranian government where he would supply them with very much needed weapons to establish and keep control of their new republic. And in turn, the hostages would be released back to the United States. And he did this still as president-elect. He made this deal. He would later follow through with a $30 million covert aid package that wouldn't come out until the Iran-Contra affair was on public display years later. Ronald Reagan would give this $30 million package to Iran, but in reality, he only gave them 12%, or 12 million rather, and the other $18 million went to another revolutionary nation where there was violence and revolution occurring in the nation in Central America of Nicaragua. The Nicaraguan government had been another one of these puppet governments set up by the United States post-Cold War, and to keep American economic interests alive and well and protected in Nicaragua. And this 40-some odd year reign of this family who won every election came to a bloody end when socialist worker party, communist-aligned rebels called the Sandinistas took over the government and established a new socialist/communist regime there. The National Guard of the nation there, the civilian National Guard in Nicaragua, was loyal to the old government and was against these socialists that had taken over the country. And they fled into the mountains and became a freedom fighter group. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But they became basically right-wing, pro-Western, pro-American rebels in the mountains, using guerrilla tactics against the Sandinistas who were in power in the valleys in Nicaragua. And so in 1982, of course, the CIA and the government was funding these rebels, right? And in 1982, Congress and the rest of America found out that these Contras, these pro-American rebel groups that were fighting to put an end to the socialist revolution, By 1982, it was uncovered that much of their operation and funding came from their partnership with a drug lord, and that they were a very big cocaine operation, and that is where most of their funding came from, was the distribution and production of cocaine to a global market. And when this was found out, the United States Congress cut off all funding to the Contras, and the CIA and the Reagan administration and the other people within what we call now the deep state, they had to find some other way to get weapons and much needed supplies to the Contras and go around the United States Congress. And this would later be known as the Iran-Contra affair. This dominates news in the middle 80s. But in 1982, when this first happened, the first thing the CIA did was start to activate some of their civilian connections. And this would include the notorious drug smuggler Barry Seals, which you'll have to follow along here where this all ties together. Barry Seals flew drugs illegally on his airplane. He had a fleet of airplanes and pilots, and a lot of the activity came out of a place called Mena, Arkansas. The airport in Mena, Arkansas was a hub for some of these smuggling operations that Barry Seal was part of. But also they reached out to patriots, the CIA did, and people that had a history of being anti-communist, and they recruited all number of civilians to work for them, to get supplies into Nicaragua and some other Central American countries who were facing similar issues. And this brings me to where this story is personal for me. In 1982, I was 14 years old. My dad was in his late 40s and going through the early stages of his midlife crisis. His many years as a preacher seemed a bit bland to him in contrast to his crazy but short career in the United States Marine Corps during Korea in the pre-Vietnam days. My uncle, my dad's brother, was still active and on duty in the United States Marine Corps, developing the next stage of weapons that we call stealth aircraft. He was involved in that, specifically the helicopters, the stealth helicopters that were being created. And we had lots of friends of the family, former military people, veterans, who were active pilots. And I can't name names even to this day, even though everyone involved at that time, except for me, has passed on. I'm going to guard the name of this family friend who was a pilot. And we met him out at an airfield one day. I got to watch him land his Piper Cub. And we had lunch with him. And this man pitched something to my dad in the summer of 1982. He made the case for the Contras, who were seen as freedom fighters standing up against communism. And he wanted my dad's help with his ministry because he was smuggling in Bibles to these countries where the communists had taken over, because many of these communist or socialist regimes saw the church as a big point of a big problem and a big enemy of the people of their country. And so there were stories of nuns and priests being executed, and in many of these countries the Bible had been banned and outlawed in those nations, just like in China and Russia at the time. And so this man, this friend of our family, this pilot, this former veteran, or I guess he is not a former veteran, he's a veteran, former military guy, approaches my dad about helping him smuggle Bibles into these war-torn countries that are involved in revolution. And this is what he said in front of other people. But later that day, he would catch my dad alone with just me present, and Dad would often talk about lots of delicate things right in front of me. And I think part of it is he didn't think I was paying attention. But this man unveils this plot to him that really what he's doing is smuggling military supplies for the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. And the whole thing is a cover story that, yes, the tops of the crates are Bibles, but when you lift them up, underneath is boots, ammunition, rifles, medical supplies. Whatever these rebels needed to advance their war against the Sandinistas was being supplied and was being smuggled in secretly. And he wanted my dad to accompany him as cover because he was a bona fide preacher, but also he needed him for backup because even though the CIA was funding this little operation through our family friend, if they were to get shot down, if they were to crash for some reason, if they were to get captured, the government would disavow them, claim they were operating outside of channels, and would say they had nothing to do with those gun smugglers. And in the event that he got shot down or the plane were to crash, he would need somebody that was good with a gun. And my dad was not only just a preacher, he was a former Marine and very well known for being very good with a gun. Upon hearing this at the age of 14, and hearing that my dad was on board for this, it was the adventure that he wanted. It played the perfect role for him. The preacher, the Marine, the combination of the two. He was down for doing this. And then I jumped in and went, "You're not going anywhere without me. You made a mistake in telling me what was really going on. And if you're going into combat in some jungle, I'm going too." I was just as hungry for adventure at 14 as he was. And I said, "I can handle a gun as good as any of you men, and I'm bigger than both of you put together," which was true. At the time, these were much smaller men, and I was a large and strong young teenage boy. And this put a wrinkle in things. I threatened to tell on him to my mom, because my mom would have never let him go, even to smuggle Bibles, much less if she knew they were smuggling rifles. And so this was a thing that was bounced back for a long time before my dad finally decided his only real option was to say no. And mainly because I had sat in on that conversation and heard what was really going on. So this is something that seems to permeate society at this point in time, is this group of people, both civilian and military, and in government and out of government, who all agree that communism is the problem and we have to stop the spread of communism, and if Congress gets in our way, we'll just figure a way around it. Well, this would give birth to what we call the Iran-Contra affair, where we found out that this money that was supposed to have gone to Iran, actually some of it went to Iran to ensure the hostages were released, which is negotiating with terrorists, which Reagan denied doing until he was busted by Colonel Oliver North, who spilled the beans about the whole project. But there was another element to this. You see, the Contras had all of this connection to drug dealers, drug manufacturers, okay, drug growers, cocaine harvesters, right? They had all this product they needed to get rid of. They needed to turn that product into money so they could buy weapons. And so part of the Iran-Contra is this drug angle, where you see this with the Barry Seals movie. He talks about it in detail in his life story. And I believe it was, drawing a blank on the Mission Impossible guy. Anyway, you know who I'm talking about. Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise played Barry Seal in a movie that tells the whole story of how the CIA was helping the Contras and other drug cartels bring drugs into the country, covering the distribution of drugs in the United States, specifically crack cocaine. And this story starts to break after Iran-Contra, when a guy, what's his name? Ricky Freeway. Ricky Freeway was the biggest crack cocaine dealer in the LA basin. And he was directly working with CIA operatives who were facilitating the poison being brought into our country and distributed through these crack dealers in major cities, Freeway Ricky being the primary one, who's come out and told his whole story about this. And drugs were being brought in and distributed to African American communities. Now, the big question is, did the CIA and the deep state specifically target black people, or is that just where the drug dealers happen to be? The people that were moving this product were moving it to those people. That is something that, different people will disagree on. I figure, yeah, it probably had something to do with it, that these same people didn't have a whole lot of love for the African American community, and had no problem destroying them with this crack epidemic of the 1980s that gave birth to these big drug cartels. It gave birth to these gangs that still plague our cities to this day. And it was all done to defeat communism, right? It was them selling out their own morals concerning drugs and crack cocaine, and for the purpose of establishing a steady flow of money into these rebels, these Contra rebels in Nicaragua and other nations in Central and South America. And right in the middle of this is a governor of a state who would later become a very powerful president by the name of Bill Clinton. That Barry Seals and that story go right through Mena, Arkansas. And there is a video that I first saw in the early 90s, was produced in the early 90s, and is weirdly still available on YouTube. It's called the Clinton Chronicles. This videotape that was widely distributed in the early 1990s when Clinton was trying to become president, and even after he was president, is a detailed description of the corruption of the Clintons as governors and business people in the state of Arkansas. And it shows how they put together a machine, a money-making machine, and overseeing these shipments of drugs coming into the country, into that Mena, Arkansas airport, was a huge part of this conspiracy that was never prosecuted, was never, the Clintons were never indicted for any of this, because many of the witnesses who could prove that this was going on in Arkansas, that Arkansas under Bill Clinton as governor was a hub for drug distribution, money laundering, and weapon smuggling, and that he got a huge cut of the pie, lined everybody's pockets. Don Tyson was all tied up in this as well. And any attempts to shine a light on this ended with people going missing, people mysteriously committing suicide in very, very unusual ways. Even to the point where I think the last bona fide Arkanside that we know of, aside from maybe whatever happened to Epstein, was a guy named Vince Foster, who was a close associate, who knew where all of the bodies were buried, who knew about all the corruption, could name names, and may have even been involved with Hillary Clinton on some romantic level. And he was found dead while the Clintons were president. He was found dead in a D.C. park, having committed suicide by shooting himself in the back of the head twice. That's a trick if you can pull it off. That's an Annie Oakley trick right there if you can pull that off. That was just covered up in all kinds of mystery and inconsistencies, and there was a big government cover-up on Vince Foster, to the point where this video may get taken down and I'm given a strike just because I'm talking about this stuff, even though it was more than 30 years ago. And so what we start to see is Bill Clinton wiggled his way into the deep state and eventually would convert the deep state from an anti-communist right-wing organization. And after his time in the presidency, after bringing his cronies with him from Arkansas, after appointing activist judges, appointing people in charge of major portions of the government, firing people who weren't aligned with him, and creating basically a new deep state. He would give the deep state an overhaul and a facelift. And it would go from being an anti-communist movement to a corrupt, line your pockets, money-grubbing, criminal conspiracy organization. involving heads of major corporations, involving the CIA, the military industrial complex, and it would bring us into a new era of the deep state. And it would almost trigger a civil war in 1994-95, and the center of that conflict being the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh in the mid 90s. So that 20-year period from 76 to 96 was such a transformative time for the world and for America in particular. And even the deep state, the anti-communists, the men in black types, the secret government spooks would meld with the remnants of the counterculture in the baby boomer generation, who went from praying for peace and harmony and wearing flowers to just figuring out how to get filthy rich and promote their social agenda globally. And so this element, through Bill and Hillary Clinton, through the corrupt government that they built in Arkansas, with their connection to the CIA and the Iran-Contra and drug smuggling network that would end with crack cocaine flooding our cities through drug dealers like Freeway Ricky, or Ricky Freeway. Freeway Ricky. This would transform not just our nation, not just give birth to things like gangster rap, not just give birth to things like inner city crime going through the roof, but also would bring corruption to our senators, our congressmen, our judges, and our law enforcement agencies. And in the next series, we'll talk about how close we came to civil war in 1995, what that was all about, the healing time after that, and how we went back to sleep only to wake up and see that the deep state was more powerful than ever. This has been our discussion, episode 2 of America's Descent into Madness. How did we get where we are? I hope you enjoyed it. There'll be at least one more episode in this series, and maybe a sermon that's linked as well. So keep an eye on my sermons as well that happen on Sundays. And we'll see you next time. Don't forget to support the channel. And we'll see you next time. Sage Wanderer from my cabin down by the creek.